Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of At War. We are joined with Aisha Malik. Today we'll be discussing the Gaza situation and looking at it from an international dimension, from an international perspective. Really what we want to discuss today is what the situation is on the ground today. How does international law really play out in what's happening? We have hopefully a ceasefire coming up soon. Though chances seem that it does look like it's still somewhat far away. We're going to look at how this conflict has impacted international law, its application, and the future of international law, really. So Aisha, I wanted to begin by asking you, how do you think the negotiations that have been taking place with regards to hostages and things, what kind of a role do you think that international law has played in that? And how do you think we're going to see this ceasefire play out in the coming years or in the coming days?
Yeah, international law doesn't really say much about getting to the process of having a ceasefire or a truce or anything, and we don't even really know what these terms mean. They're kind of indefined and used interchangeably. But in terms of the current situation, I think is that Hamas has left the talks in Qatar, in Cairo, and there's not going to be a truce before Ramadan, so we're likely to see a Rafah ground offensive by Israel. We are seeing a very, very adamant Israel in the sense that there is no let up. We do feel like international pressure is being brought to bear a little bit from the US, from Germany, as they're seeing an increasingly solidified, perhaps, third world going against them. And the fact that they're now kind of isolated in being allies with this organization where you're being live streamed its atrocities in real time.
Absolutely.
And the fact that a lot of the states in the ICJ hearings on the occupation were referring to Israel as being an indolent child of international law.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that was a very apt characterization of what they've been doing, because Netanyahu doesn't seem to be wanting to let up. The talk of the hostages is really something to hammer Hamas with, or anyone who goes against Israel. So in terms of international law and how it works now, we've seen that in the ICJ hearing. So the International Court of Justice has had South Africa take Israel to task for genocide. Nicaragua has now taken Germany to task for being complicit and aiding and assisting in the genocide.
Which is really interesting.
Very interesting. We'll talk more about that.
Especially if anything comes out of that.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It might have jumped the gun a little bit in that application. And we've seen ICJ hearings on an advisory opinion on the Israeli occupation, which very importantly were filed a year before the October 7th attack. So it just happened to be happening in the midst of all of this, which will definitely affect the court in how it comes to its legal opinion on that.
No, absolutely. It's just, looking at what we're seeing, at least what we're seeing in the news, is that there's a lot more pressure now on Israel. And even, earlier on in the conflict, what we saw was that the Biden administration had basically given the new year as the time to get your stuff done, whoever you have to target. But that obviously has lingered on, and you're very right. The Israelis have been very adamant on that. But what we're hearing now is that there's a ton of more pressure. But again, we also have an election year in the US, right? And if there's anyone that can apply pressure to the Israelis, it's the Americans. And the Biden administration, I think, is feeling a pinch from Muslim voters, and not just Muslim voters, but people who are fundamentally opposed to the way Israel is executing this conflict and their war. So I think it's more politics right now, especially with regards to a ceasefire, than it is international law. But I do enjoy seeing, Israel squirm when it comes to proceedings at the ICJ, and whether or not we're going to see something from the ICC, especially.
And I think so. One of the rumors that I heard, which I found to be a very interesting one, and kind of a play into this, what is happening on the backstage of global politics, is the rumor that Russia asked South Africa to file the application because they wanted to discredit the court, which famously a year before had asked it to halt its military operations and had said that it was in clear violation of international law. It was the aggressor state. So that would be very interesting. But what I find even more interesting is the way in which South Africa has handled this. so when the South African legal team went back from The Hague after the public hearings, it was greeted with like an Olympic football team welcome. Like people were holding up banners saying, some heroes don't wear capes, they have LLBs. It's been a massive uniting force in South African society. But also we're seeing a kind of tug of war now among the Global South, who will be the leader of the Global South.
Yeah.
If India had done this, I think it would be very clear that it would be India who would be leading. India, of course, is in cahoots with Israel. They did not even file a written statement or appear before the ICJ on the advisory opinion on the occupation. South Africa has really taken up that mantle, and I think it's won the affection of so many in the Global South. And I think that reputationally, that's something it's going to be a strength in the future.
And what you're saying, I mean, even in the BRICS, all the BRICS countries other than India, for example, they are taking one side.
Yes, completely.
And India, again, because of, say, its relationship with the US or how it's trying to portray its global dominance, is taking a backseat there. Aisha, we've heard quite a bit about the hypocrisy that is behind what's happening there, and that there's a different strategy with regards to from the West with regards to Russia, and a completely different even on some of the same issues, international issues with regards to Gaza. How badly do you think international law has taken a beating in this, in the midst of this, in the crossfire?
So I actually think that international law currently is winning because everybody is seeing that you can actually take a powerful country to the ICJ because Israel does not have a reservation to the relevant conventions. The reason why Nicaragua is taking Germany to the ICJ and not the US, which is definitely a closer ally, more powerful supporter, is because the US has reserved ICJ jurisdiction under the Genocide Convention. So everything is being done under the Genocide Convention because that's the only jurisdictional basis we have, which is in some ways bad for international law because there are so many other clear violations being committed, and yet none of those can be taken to the ICJ. In some ways, I do worry about we talked about this in a previous episode about of our IHL in film, about the genocide label, what that means. Are they committing genocide? I don't know.
But don't you think that because the only option states have is the Genocide Convention, genocide is exceptionally difficult, notoriously difficult to prove, that itself is a failure of international law, that we don't have really any other recourse other than something that we know is probably not going to work?
Yes.
Or there's a strong degree that it's a chance that it's not going to work.
Yeah, and I think I think the reason it doesn't genocide might not cover it is because states have not wanted it to cover it. In part Western states and powerful states, in part other states. So when Germany came out and said we might file in favor of Israel, Namibia immediately came out and said, you guys did the biggest genocide of us, the first one of the 20th century, so sit down. And Germany immediately took a step back.
Really? Wow.
And the notion is that you have genocide is one of those things which is overcharacterized and at the same time undercharacterized. Most states probably have a genocide in their history that they have committed. And at the same time, what we look at as genocide, mass killings, which it isn't, is usually a crime against humanity. It's not genocide. It's not done with that incredibly high intent to destroy the group. Darfur, the UN Commission, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, decided it was not genocide, but they were like, it's a crime against humanity, which is just as bad, guys. It doesn't mean anything for it not to be. Similarly, in the Bosnian genocide case, they only said in Srebrenica you had genocide. All of the other instances were not genocide. So when you killed 8,000 military-aged males there, and you got rid of the entire population in a patriarchal society and drove them out, that counted as genocide. The others, not so much. So Croatia's application there failed. So it's one of those things where it's like, is it a failure of international law for this not to be genocide? I don't think so. But if it isn't, Israel will treat it as an exoneration, which is also a bad thing. So I think right now, our job as international lawyers is to educate everyone on what this is.
Absolutely.
Rather than... I think especially a third world and critical approach is that this has to be genocide. Let's make it genocide. But what do we do then if the court decides it isn't? And we know from our past precedent that the court might not decide that.
Yeah, I think that there is some credence to the argument that let's not cheapen, what genocide is.
Yeah.
Right? We've reserved this as the worst form of human action that can take place, right? And that's why there is such a high standard to it. But at the same time, the kind of atrocities that are taking place in Palestine right now, where there's open starvation, where they're denying humanitarian trucks in, that certainly, I think, is something that can, at least in the public imagination, like, if this isn't genocide, what is, right?
Yeah.
And I think, and it's, like, legally speaking, we can come up with, with categorizations. We can say, it's crimes against humanity and it's war crimes that are taking place, so that's fine. But convincing people or trying to retain that trust and that credibility of international law in the general public, right? I think that is something that we're going to lose out on.
So this is something I struggle with, because I definitely don't think genocide is the worst crime. It's an affront to human diversity, because you're trying to destroy an entire group of people on ethnic, racial, religious, national grounds. Sure. I can't look at the killing fields of Cambodia where 200,000 plus people died and be like, it was really bad what happened to you. It's not genocide, though, as if that was something which is much worse. So at the same time as it not being one of the worst crimes, it doesn't matter, because that is what it is in the public imagination. So even when you look at the history of international criminal tribunals, when they're doing plea agreements, they're always saying, please drop the genocide charge, I will take the crimes against humanity charge. They never do that the other way around. They never drop the crimes against humanity, I'll take the genocide charge. So whatever way you look at it, people do think it is the worst crime to commit. And at the same time, as when you're saying, if this isn't genocide, what is? Regardless of what you're saying about displacement, push them into the Sinai, what you are doing is, in an open-air prison, you are starving this population.
Yeah.
And I think the way that they've dropped the tonnage of bombs that they've dropped on Gaza, the way, in terms of deliberately inflicting upon them conditions of life brought about to, bring about their physical destruction, it would be hard to look at that situation in Gaza and not think it could be at that level.
No, absolutely. No, thank you for that. It's just, I still feel that I think there is, and we know this, and maybe I'm just making too much out of this, but we know that there are gaping holes in international law, right?
Yeah.
International law is ultimately the least common denominator between states, and that's what they put into treaties and what they negotiate on and agree on. But I still feel that something like this, if we can't have proper redressal mechanisms for it, and if the ICC is still going to continue to drag its feet, as we've seen it doing, frankly speaking, that this is going to become a huge problem for the credibility of international law going forward, right? And who are we? Because what we're seeing, I think, is an abdication of their responsibility. Countries like the US and countries who keep on stressing on having a rules-based international global rules-based order. I think they've lost all credibility there. There is no, there's different set of rules that apply to Ukraine. The same situation or worse will be taking place in Israel, and there's nothing there.
Yeah.
Right? So these are some of the issues there.
Yeah, I wonder with the, this rules-based international order, when people argue, like John Dugard, the head of the South Africa legal team, he argues, get rid of that. That doesn't mean anything. Let's just talk about international law. And so even when we look at even countries that are very sympathetic to Russia, I would think in some ways I have my sympathies towards Russia. If you have NATO encirclement the way you have it, I think that you have been heavily provoked. At the same time, blatant violation of international law cannot be allowed. That is an act of aggression. Similarly, and I think applying just international law as it is, because we can be critical of it, we can be critical of the enforcement, we can be critical of who gets taken to the ICJ and how, we can be critical of how states handle it. I mean, you're sending aid to and military support to Ukraine and to Israel. For me, it doesn't make any sense, and you can't come at us with any kind of moral authority anymore. And the rise of multipolarity is also going to change that in a lot of ways. But at the same time, when it comes to Hamas's actions on October 7th, when it comes to Israel's actions, international law allows it to be very clear. For me, the first phase of the Al-Aqsa brigades was a legitimate act of resistance, because you're going after the IDF. When you're then going to the kibbutzim and when you're then going to attack civilians at the rave, international violation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what we should encourage national liberation movements to do is to prosecute those themselves, court-martial your own armed forces for that. Similarly, when it comes to what Israel is doing, blatant war crimes, blatant crimes against humanity as well. And yet, and we need to have this, international law allows us to have the same and very consistent viewpoint on what's right and what's wrong, I think.
Yeah,
and I think regardless of the politics surrounding it, and I think with the Palestinian people, and I think that's also why it's very interesting to look at the delegitimization of Hamas and how that's gone about, because we are only meant to look at them in terms of the carnage of October 7th and not anything else.
Yeah.
And that is something that's been done throughout history with national liberation movements.
No, and what that also does is that gives a lot of leeway for targeting to Israel, right?
Yeah.
Because if everything is Hamas, if every government building, if every ministry, if the health ministry is Hamas-run health ministry, then that becomes deeply problematic, right? Because that means that everything's a legitimate target, even when they aren't. We've seen them destroy the parliament building or the legislative building that Hamas used to use. And that becomes, it really blurs the lines for, I think, a lot of the issues there.
And I think it's also a problem of narrative, the way people have said it in defense of the Palestinians, perhaps, which is that Hamas does not represent the Palestinians, and so they cannot be collectively punished. I'm like, but Hamas might represent the Palestinian people, right? I mean, their support on the West Bank has soared. And they seem to be, the allegiance the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip have shown to Hamas has been quite strong, right? We're not seeing a kind of defection in the way that you might see. So I think the better way of phrasing it might be to say that Hamas might represent the Palestinian people and they should still not be collectively punished for them.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
If we were to have elections tomorrow and Hamas wins, then it's like, oh, the Palestinian people want this. That's not something which detracts from their protection under international law.
Absolutely. My final question is really on the future of international law, and within the context of Israel-Palestine. Do you feel that this conflict is going to have some impact on the realization of a two-state solution? We do see that being discussed, and it's something that a lot of states are now pushing for, that there needs to be some level of recognition of a Palestinian state, and the situation that we've been in for the past several decades, where Israel has paid lip service to this, if at all, and then actually actively work towards undermining any sort of two-state solution. Do you think we're going to see something coming out of that? So
I really have no idea about that question. I would actually want to hear your views on it as well. What I heard someone saying, when something just resonates with you, but you don't know enough about it, about the political background, or like people enough who've been brainstorming about a political solution to this to say anything. But she likened it to a two-state solution would be like someone breaking into your house and saying, okay, now this is mine. And then you agree that we're just going to live in this house together. But like, I'm not allowed in that area, you're not allowed in this area. And to give them that part of your house, rather than you should have a one-state solution and allow everyone to live there in harmony. At the same time, that is probably quite an archaic notion at this point. Maybe it could have worked in the first few decades after 1947, 1948, but perhaps now in 2024, that's very, very unlikely. And the best solution would be a one-state solution. But I'm not sure. I have no idea.
So I still think that the only viable solution remains a two-state solution. The only problem is, I don't think that a two-state solution is, we're not talking about two equal states, right? That even if anything were to emerge, it would be a deeply demilitarized, defanged, skeleton of a state for the Palestinians, right? Because Israel has repeatedly, and I don't think there's any government in Israel that would allow for an independent sovereign state of Palestine to exist, right? Which would have its own ability to defend itself or to do any sort of harm to the Israeli government, and that's been their argument for quite some time now. So this notion that we'll have a two-state solution, what does that really mean? Right? At this point in time, and ultimately, I think the Israelis are very happy I think, have been very content with having this low intensity conflict taking place. They can always paint themselves as the victims, even though they have a 95, 98%, rocket interception success rate. So for all practical purposes, there's nothing really damaging for Israel in this situation. It's only when an October 7th type attack takes place that they then have to respond with such overwhelming might that it is collective punishment, and it's the people of Palestine that ultimately, withdraw any sort of support. Do we see that happening? Do we see, for example, Palestinians saying, yes, we've learned our lesson, we will never hurt the Israelis? I don't think so, frankly speaking. I think you've created more freedom fighters than before. I think this is a point of no return in that struggle. It's going to be extremely difficult to have these people forgive and forget what Israel has done. And that goes, I think, for the wider, Muslim world, frankly. So this is, I think, a turning point in what's going to happen. I think the crisis is going to intensify, unfortunately. I don't see it being resolved very quickly. And what is perhaps the biggest victim, in my opinion, is that the tools for coercion, if you will, or tools to convince people, states within, whether it's the Palestinians or it's the Israelis, to act in a particular way, those have been shot down. Right? We've seen that it's really a single phone call of the U.S. president to Netanyahu. We're cutting off aid. That's never been utilized, and it hasn't been utilized, and it won't be utilized. Right? We've seen what the red lines are for the West with regards to Israel. They're not willing to cross. Allow anything to take place or harm, not even a UN Security Council resolution asking for a ceasefire. So I think it's going to be problematic. The other thing that we've seen is that the Arab world has lost a lot of say in this matter. Right? They completely have abandoned the Palestinians in this entire thing.
Yeah, and we saw them at the ICJ hearing. The Saudi representative giving a very strong, very forceful speech, and you're like, it totally obfuscates what you're doing on the ground, which is not helping the Palestinians at all. It's really nice to go and cry up on a podium, but yet in actual material terms, you have so much that you can give and that you refuse to.
Absolutely, and it's when you have this this entity which is in a state which is then now forced to reconcile with the fact that nobody's supporting it. I think that's when it's most dangerous as well. Right. So if you don't have any levers to pull, you're stuck.
I think it's super interesting that Israel manages to paint itself as the victim when you're the only military superpower with nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Just by that fact alone, there is no way you are the aggressor. You are the most powerful state in the Middle East purely by that. And the fact that they are so trying to take any kind of role that Iran would have to play in the international community away from it. And yet we're seeing Iran act through non-state actors to try and reclaim some of that power. And then again, a completely impotent Arab world, which will go down in history for having not helped what is probably the most important moral crisis of our times entirely. But the notion of statehood as well is so important, because I don't think Palestine is a state yet. I think it is in the in-between stage of being like a self-determination entity, but we don't know what to do with this. Has observer status at the UN, and Yasser Arafat very famously went and gave his first speech at the General Assembly as a non-observer state. What is a non-observer state? We don't know anything what to do with anything under international, which isn't a state, because we only see states and we see individuals as being nationals of states. So when you take that away from an entity, and yet when you look at what's happening in Gaza, you're like, which state can command the allegiance that these people came day after bloody day to the state of Palestine? No other state in the world can command that level of allegiance. And yet they haven't been given statehood. And I think that the more the world is forced to move to give that. And I think that's one of the most important stepping stones of this. Get rid of the veto. Because the P5 veto is probably the worst thing that we still have in an international world order. Give that power to the General Assembly, and also make Palestine a state. And the minute we know, because the parallels between the Indian subcontinent and Israel-Palestine are quite stark. So we've partitioned. We are also a minority made on religious grounds. So people think that makes us Israel. I completely disagree. I think that makes us maybe not Palestine, actually, in history. But also the fact that both of us had to get nuclear weapons for there to be peace.
Yeah.
For there to be peace in the Middle East. Peace
continued
here.
Survival, yeah.
Yeah, for continued survival. And also one of the very interesting things that I found out was that Israel actually took Pakistani laws. We use those laws to decide what are we going to do with all of this new population, and the fact that we tried to keep that evacuee property for the Hindus and Sikhs, which had left. And then we were like, okay, we can't keep that for them. We need it for our own population, so we used it to resettle. They took our laws and transplanted them into their Israeli legal system to dispossess Palestinians from their land.
My God.
And so in terms of a partitioned land, we know what that's like, and we know that, and that's also why we fall so heavily on the Palestinian side.
No, absolutely. Actually, there are many other questions, but I think we're running out of time. I want to thank you again for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. I hope you found this useful. Thank you.